So, Ben, it's very nice to meet you. I'm Nathan.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you for being here. You're a PhD. You got your PhD at Harvard.
Stanford.
Stanford, and you teach history at the University of Saskatchewan here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what made you get interested in history originally, I guess?
It's funny. So both my parents are English teachers, professors. And so I was very clear that I did not want to study English.
Yeah, fair enough.
0% interested. And growing up, it was kind of weird. I disliked reading. To this day, I still do not enjoy reading. I love learning. I love learning all different kinds of things, but reading is my least favorite way to do it. And so becoming a historian is kind of a weird career path. And I just fell in love with history by playing video games. I played Age of Empires and Civilization and Rise of Nations and all of these games and movies. I just wanted to know more and more and more about how people in the past lived their lives and thought of the world. And the more I learned about the past, the more I got to see parallels between the problems that I was seeing in the present and the ones people had dealt with in the past. And you got to see all of these different attempted solutions in different time, different place, all of that. But you got to see people practicing some of the challenges, their solutions to some of the challenges that I was facing or seeing our society face. And so I sort of fell in love with history early on in this sort of weird and roundabout way where it was the games I was playing, not necessarily the books I was reading. And I read the books to understand the games that I was playing. And that's sort of how I started falling in love with history.
Wow. That's really cool. I would have not guessed that at all. Those games are, I know they're very popular, a lot of them. So you mentioned Civ.
Yeah.
I've got buddies that they've tried to get me into it a couple of times, and I don't have the attention span, unfortunately, but I like watching. It's weird that I say I don't have the attention span because I like watching them play. Yeah. But I struggle with them myself. But it's fascinating that people have built games like that that are very fun and strategic, and then allow you to learn about the past like that.
Yeah, and so that's actually one of the things that I came back to once I started teaching was, I'm not alone in loving history because of the games I played. And so I want to build games. And so that's one of the things that I've been doing for my research recently is thinking about how you can convey a more complex history, right? Civ, wonderful game. Age of Empires, these are wonderful games.
Yeah.
But they don't really teach you history super well unless you go out afterwards and decide you want to learn. Like I first encountered a trebuchet, like a giant catapult in those games. And I was like, oh, how does that work? Right? And, I wanted to know, is this accurate? And so a lot of my learning happened after the game. And so I'm really interested in trying to build games that inherently teach the kinds of things that I suck at as a teacher. And the idea behind it's really simple. If I suck at teaching this, if my game crashes and burns, oh well, I sucked at that anyways.
Yeah, right.
And so once I sort of got my PhD and got a full-time job, I realized I could start doing research on just about anything. And so I have different interests, but one of them became games and how people have learned about history in the past. So I have an article that I finished a couple of years ago on how representations of indigenous people appear in games in North America and Germany.
Actually, I think I just read the... Unfortunately, I didn't get to read the whole paper, but I think I just read the abstract this morning. Was that... I'm sorry to cut you off. Was that Cardboard Indians?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I'm going to read that after, I think.
Yeah, so it's this really... I never thought you could do research on games. But there's actually an archive in Rochester, New York called the Strong Museum of Play that houses all of the old toys across the United States and Canada. So old doll houses, old video games, old board games. And what's crazy about it when you think about it is how do you preserve those things? So a dollhouse is really easy, right? Don't let it get wet. Don't light it on fire. But a video game, you have to not just preserve the video game, but you have to preserve an old computer that still works from now 40 years ago. And so that becomes a new kind of challenge. You can create emulators and all of that, but when I was there in the archive playing some of the video games, and there's some really, you can imagine, fairly offensive and racist stuff. They had to bring out an old, Windows 3.1 computer.
Yeah, something that still plays it. Right?
Yeah, and they have to maintain those things. And that was just something that I never even thought about as a challenge to the world that we live in, where when you're trying to preserve digital infrastructure and these pieces of our past that are now on computers, you have to also preserve the computers, which is kind of crazy to think about.
It is weird. Yeah, it's strange because you would think as things get more and more advanced, they'd be able to just do the stuff that the old machines have been able to do, but they can't sometimes. I don't know if you still play video games very much, but I've in the PC gaming world that happens sometimes, I think, where people will buy old games and they'll go to run them, and the game will tell them that their computer doesn't meet the specifications to run the game, even though it's so far beyond.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and so that was sort of my first opportunity to see the games people made in the past. They're really, really, really cool. A lot of those early games they're terrible games. Like, don't get me wrong, they're just straight terrible. If you played Candyland, you've played all of these games. You wouldn't roll a dice because in the past, dice were associated with gambling. So you'd spin a spinner. Why that was not associated with gambling is not altogether clear. But the artwork on these games and their messaging is really, really interesting. So there's one game about, a lot of them are about teaching. We think of games as for fun, but in the 19th century, these games are all about teaching people the way to live your life properly.
Okay.
So there's a game called West Point Cadets, where you're becoming a cadet for the U.S. military. And every time something bad happens to you, it's because you made a bad moral choice. You were gambling or you were, doing all of these things. And it's kind of like Snakes and Ladders, which was also a game to teach, right? Every time you hit on one of the snake, that was you committing a sin or something like that and falling back. And every time you hit a ladder, that was you doing something virtuous. And a lot of these early games were kind of like that, where they were meant to teach children how to live as an adult and how to live as a good person.
That's really fascinating. It makes sense too, because that's always a goal of society, is how do we educate our youth properly, right? Whereas that's really interesting though, because we, like you said, we don't think about them that way anymore. It's more of a way to blow off steam or just kill some time.
And it's interesting. So Strong Museum of Play, amazing place if you ever have a chance to go.
All right, Strong Museum of Play.
Yeah, so it's this museum that's filled with toys, and as you can imagine, it's just fun. Right? Like they have giant controller pads that you play Mario with. They have old 3D games, like all of these old and new games. And so it's just imagine that it's like this kid's paradise. Super fun place to go. And what I found really interesting is you have every toy that you could imagine that's available to kids. And I guess just a question for you. What do you think the kids chose? Right? These are kids from maybe the age of 6 until, 13-ish.
The guns and the dolls for boys and girls. Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Sorry, you said you were okay without coffee, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I thought they'd play the video games, right? You have like all of these screens, you have these interactive dance parties and whatnot, dolls and guns, right? That makes good sense. Oddly enough, the place that they liked the most was a fake grocery store.
That really?
Yeah. And it's like, the way it works is you have a little cart, and you're this little kid, and you push the cart in, and you grab your vegetables and whatnot, and then you push it to the front, and then you run around the till, and you scan your items through.
Weird.
Literally something you have to pay me to do. Right? It's literally a job. But it's a chance for them to practice being an adult.
Yeah.
And that, for whatever reason, captivated them more than all the toys and the dolls and the video games. Like, you had to pull these kids out screaming. That's how much they wanted to be there.
That is so interesting.
It's just unbelievable to me that something that literally you have to pay people to do because it's not that fun is something that the kids found to be the most engaging thing I've ever seen.
Weird. That is really interesting. It's I was actually listening to a psychology lecture the other day on YouTube, and the psychologist was talking about how that's one of the games that kids play in school a lot of the time. So they go out in recess and they want to play house.
Yeah.
With everyone. It's weird that they would do that because you're playing house at home all the time already.
And this comes out of the 19th century. So the time period that I really like studying, this is where kindergarten and some of those, the other ideas about how children should grow up. And their idea was that toys and games are one of the ways that you transmit knowledge from adults to children. And we still do this a bunch. Like, you think of the toys that we give kids. You have them little kitchen sets.
Right.
Like a lot of our toys are actually teaching them about how to be an adult. And a lot of those toys were developed, like I said, in the 19th century, when they realized how powerful play was to teaching people things. And so in the 19th century, it was a little bit different. They would give girls, for example, a doll, right? Something that you mentioned, right? Makes sense. But they would give them a doll that was incomplete. And so if you actually wanted your toy, you had to not just learn the sort of ideas behind it, maybe gender roles or things like that, but you had to learn the practical skills necessary. So in this case, if you wanted your doll to have clothes, well, you had to sew them for your doll.
Wow.
And so in the process, you learned to sew, right? And you'd give boys in the 19th century engineering toys, right? So they would build these toys. They'd learn some crafting, like some woodworking, things like that. But they'd also learn the physics of motion or whatever other skill that you were trying to teach them. And so they were really, really conscious about the kinds of toys that they gave. And they're gendered, right? You gave boys and girls very different toys.
Yeah.
But they sort of saw the path ahead of the skills that you'd need for your adult life, and then would try and structure early play around picking up those skills in sort of a scaffolded way.
This is so interesting. Why do you think it became like? Well, I guess you said because it's like kids like games, but why do you think it became games instead of just instruction?
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful question. So some of this actually has to do with how childhood changed. So in the 19th century, you started working real young.
Mm.
You know, you had kids 8, 10 years old working in factories. You had high childhood mortality. You had a large number of children. And so all of these things encouraged, people were quite poor. Right. They didn't have the kind of money that, even though we're going through economic challenges today, like compared to what they were going through in the 19th century, like we live a pretty good life. Mm. And so, if you're not sending your kid to school necessarily and they're learning to work early, right, toys and games are much less frequent. And so that changes for a whole host of reasons. One of them is people start having less kids, so you can put more attention into each of the kids. You begin to expect your kid to live, not to die at 2 or at 5, to live, a full length of life. And there became a sort of new idea that childhood should be protected. That childhood was a time of experimentation and learning and fun. And that in some ways would have been a luxury to those in the 19th century where, you need food. Everyone in your family has to work because you don't have money. And so some of this is industrialization and rising standards of living and all of this. There creates more time for childhood, right? The idea of a teenager starts to develop.
Yeah.
Before people saw children as like early, like young adults in like the weirdest ways. Like in the States, you could sign a contract at like 8.
Jeez. Yeah.
Right? Like a binding, like legal.
Weird.
Right? But that changes. Right now we would say, oh, you're under 18, you're a child still, we have all sorts of protections. Very, very different than the 19th century. And so this new idea of childhood as this protected space emerges for hundreds of reasons, but some of them, like I said, is a rising standard of living.
So that seems similar to like kind of what we're seeing today now too, with so much prosperity that people are becoming more and more creative. Like there's so much content on the internet because they have more free time. Or are you kind of saying it's along those lines? As the family becomes more prosperous, they can free up time for their children to be children, essentially? That started happening in the 1800s?
Yeah. So, I mean, industrialization is a long process, so it's going to play out differently in different times and places. But the sort of dark side of industrialization, one of them is people have more wealth. There's more goods in society. The downside is you're also seeing kids get maimed, like really young kids, right? The machines in the 19th century don't have the safeties that we now put on machines. These are just like open saws and open gears, and you have kids are desirable because they have very small and nimble fingers. And so they're small so they can move in and out of machines, grabbing things. They're weaving and other things that require a fair amount of dexterity. But they didn't have the kind of safety mechanisms. And so people are dying in pretty gross and horrific ways. And so as you're seeing this rising prosperity, you also see this change in society towards we need some workplace protections. And it's not that businesses actively are wanting to do this because those are expensive. This is people fighting and unionizing and all of these things. And so you have it's one of the moments in time where you have the strongest unionization. And you don't need as many people working as many hours to get, food and clothing and all of this. Because you have machines that can now handle some of this. So it's a bunch of different factors. But watching kids get maimed is a pretty gross thing. So you have that kind of push as well, that maybe children shouldn't be doing these ultra dangerous jobs.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating too, just to think that it was ever that way, because you look back and you're like, it's so great that they came up with those changes. But I was we had friends over not last night, the night before, and we were talking about how societies just did not think the way that people think today about like the value of human life and protecting each other. I'm like, that's a pretty old idea. Mm-hmm. So it's weird to think that stuff like that, like the idea that maybe we shouldn't let children be getting maimed in factories, is it's not that old of a thought. But it's good that it's around now, of course. So
yeah, and people had a different relationship with death. Mm-hmm. Right? If you grew up burying people all of the time, or if you grew up thinking you're going to lose a third of your children before the age of 5 or something like that, right? You have just a different relationship to your children. You have a different relationship to your family. If you're expecting that if you live, to be an old person, that you're going to have had 4 or 5 spouses, right? Some of that's disease, right? Disease really, really devastating. Some of it's accidents, especially in an industrialized place. I actually got here a little bit late because of the train was running through.
Oh, yeah.
But if you think about it, if you had not grown up with a train and that was a new thing that you were experiencing, you might not give that train the necessary distance, right? It might kick up rocks. You might think that, I can just get past it and misjudge the distance, right? There's streetcars being built. There's a world that is in some ways way cooler and better than the one before, but also it's a really scary place, right? Workplace accidents go way up. You have trolleys and trains and other things intermixing with horses. And so, just moving through a city in the 19th century was not the safest of things. And so people are sort of experimenting with a new world, a new geography, a new set of mechanization. And as they're figuring out how to move through that world, people make mistakes and people get maimed and killed. There's a really cool book called The Accidental Republic on sort of this early transition in the United States.
Okay.
And people who get caught in all of these workplace accidents. And you can actually see this damage on people's bodies. So one of the other things that I research is the Canadian prison system. And we've got really good records for Saskatchewan. From about 1890 until about 1930, we've got every person who enters Regina and Prince Albert Penitentiary.
Oh, wow, okay, yeah.
And you sort of think about it, they didn't have photographs in the way that we do today, right? Like now we've got a camera, you can just toss it up, not a big deal. In the 19th century, there are photographs, but they take a long time to set up and they're pretty expensive. You'd only use them for things of note. And so you wouldn't want to take a bunch of pictures of prisoners necessarily. That comes a bit later. And so what you would do is you describe their body, you'd strip them naked, and you'd look for every mole on their body, every disfigurement, every cut or abrasion or frostbite, every vaccination scar. Because if you find them again, if they escape, you want to know, is this the same person? And so if there was really heavy damage done to your body, amputated arm, heavy tattooing, they just record those big things, right? That would be enough to determine this is the same person. But if you didn't have those kinds of markings, they would mark, cut across eyebrow, 15 small scratches here, burn from whatever. And what's cool is they seem to have asked the people where some of those injuries came from.
Oh, okay.
Right? You wouldn't necessarily be able to look at someone and be like, that's frostbite. Or that burn was caused at work. Right? You just know that they're burnt. But clearly there's some sort of discussion that's happening because some of the comments are so specific that only the person who suffered that injury would know. But anyways, we have 35,000 people who we have every mark on their body, their height, their weight, their ethnicity. I think we might either have their job or could figure out their job. Although in the prairies at this time, most of the people are farmers, so
Yeah, right.
That's not as interesting. But for me, that's one of the things that I haven't finished work on, but I really hope to figure out is how can we understand this world and all these injuries on people's bodies and see how, growing up at a different time might have exposed you to different risks, or being from a different ethnic group, right, who might have done different kinds of jobs, how that actually gets written on your body. So we've done the digitization, but with 35,000 people, you can imagine every time you just even go through and read all the descriptions, you're talking 2 or 3 weeks of time. So that's still left to do.
Well, how long do you anticipate that project taking?
I'm terrible at estimating. So I thought this project started 5-6 years ago. It's involved more than 20 people. Like, to give you a sense of the scale, 10 people helped digitize the prison records, and then another 10 have cleaned and categorized them.
Okay.
So, something like height and weight is really easy. It should be a number, and if it's not, you can flag it with a computer. But what about something like ethnicity, right? These are prison guards who are writing whatever they want, or skin color, right? How do you lump the 1,000 different ways that you could record skin color into something that you could actually usefully use, maybe as 10 categories? And so that process of categorizing and sort of lumping together the 1,000 different ways that you could write something into something a little bit more usable has taken just years and years and years and years.
Yeah,
what we're doing right now, which is I think the last thing I need to standardize, is, I guess I'll take a step back. We started this project to try and understand the impact of colonialism.
Okay.
And so we were really interested in height and weight, right? Height tells you someone's long-term nutrition, and their weight tells you their short-term nutrition.
I didn't know that. It makes sense. So the height is correlated with how well your diet.
Childhood diet.
Oh, okay.
And not for an individual, right? There's genetic factors, but when you have tens and tens of thousands of records, you can watch changes in long-term nutrition.
Yeah,
it's not perfect. But the project I was a part of wanted to do this across the whole world. So it's South Africa, Canada, Tasmania, all of these different places. And prison records are unique in that they're one of the only records in the world at the time that give you height and weight across a wide selection of people. So, for example, the Prince Albert and Regina Jail has prisoners as young as about 8.
Wow.
All the way up.
Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, all the way up to people in their 80s and 90s.
Wow.
And it's 35,000 people. It includes men, women, and children. That's very, very uncommon. Now, obviously, prisoners are not representative of society, right? That's just a big challenge. But they're more representative of society than the other places you can find height and weight records, which is military enlistments, where you only get young men, 18 to 30, who are mostly in good physical shape, right? That's an even more problematic record set. And so one of the questions that the team had was, can you trace the impact of colonialism on Indigenous people and settlers over time? So we know that there's mass starvation on the plains, decline of the bison, all of those kinds of changes. And so you can watch Indigenous people's heights just slowly decline over time.
Whoa.
Right? And you can watch, in some cases, their weight as well. And the question is, do you see a correlation in the opposite direction of settlers? Right? Many of these people are coming from pretty poor places in Europe, right? You think about the Irish famine and all of these other push factors, right? Like, the people coming to Canada are often not in the greatest of shape. They're either facing religious persecution or they're facing famines or other things. Like, that's the reason they left.
Yeah.
And so over time, do you see their health or their heights in the roughest sense, and their weights slowly improve over time? And the challenge is you need a ton of people to measure this, right? This is either the pattern has to be really blunt or you need a lot of people. And so the overall idea is if we can get prisons across all of Canada and especially in places like Saskatchewan where you have a high Indigenous population, and BC where you have a high Indigenous population. Can you see those changes? And so that's sort of where this project began, and that's something a man named Chris Inwood out of the University of Guelph, he's really, really interested in that portion.
Yeah.
I sort of was brought onto this project, not as interested in that trend, although it's super cool, but more interested in what else can you use these prison records for. They're really expensive to digitize. They took a lot of time. And so one of the questions I had was, do you see racism in the Canadian court system?
Okay.
And your first guess is, yeah, probably in the 19th century. But it's actually really, really complicated because who the victim is changes how the courts punish people. So if the victim is, a rich, white, prominent member of the community, the punishments for who did damage to them or violated some of their rights may well be higher. So who's the victim might matter more than who's the perpetrator. And so you have to keep both of those in mind, and we don't have perfect information.
Yeah, wow.
But then my second thought was, if we do find that, is it tied to who the judge is, right? Maybe it's just like 3 racist judges.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right? And that you'd want to know. And this is where I'm stuck at the moment, which is, in order to do that, you need to know the ethnicity of the perpetrator, which we do. It's just written in the prison records. You need to know how long they were sentenced for, which I actually don't know, because the prison registers, which is what I have, tell you the option a prisoner was given. In the 19th century, you had a choice a lot of times on how you were punished. You could take a fine or you could take prison time.
Okay.
Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Right? If you had money, you did the fine. If you didn't, you probably went to prison. So in the records, it'll say something like, $15 fine or 30 days hard labor. And that's sort of doable. But the really complicated cases will have like 15 options.
Oh, okay, yeah.
30 days hard labor or $3 fine plus $15 cost. And it just keeps going on and on and on. And so you don't actually know what the final punishment that person experienced was.
Okay, so you have, just so I follow you, you have these people come in and they get a log.
Yeah.
Then that's what you're looking at, and you see their options, but it doesn't tell you whether they chose incarceration or a fine. Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes you have a release date, in which case you can sort of backtrack and be like, okay, they were in prison for 30 days. They chose the 30-day option.
Yeah.
But a lot of the records are sort of incomplete. The people who recorded this were really good when the prisoner entered, and they filled in the logbook pretty well. They weren't always very good about when a prisoner left. And so we're sort of missing that. So that's
so weird.
That's challenge one, is we don't know exactly what the sentence they faced was. We just know the range. So that's a challenge. And then the challenge that I'm facing right now is they didn't spend a lot of time on these records. And so when they put a judge's name, they just put their initials and their rank. And so it's really easy with like a district court judge. There's not that many of them. They don't have overlapping initials. You can just figure that out. But at the time, a lot of these cases are dealt with by justices of the peace. So these are like really low-ranking members of the judicial system. And there's like hundreds of them.
Yeah.
And so knowing that there's an IE justice of the peace, I'm not confident there's not 2 of those people. And if you standardize them, and you'll have like, Robert Smith, and then you'll have an R Smith, and then they'll write it RS. And you need to be confident that that's the same person. And so we've gone back to the old records, and we've digitized, we just finished this part, every justice of the peace over time. So that when we see an RS, we can look and see, is there only one person, like a Robert Smith? Or is there, a Robert Sampson? In which case we don't know which of those 2 to pair with.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're at right now, is the standardization of old records that were sort of incomplete and improperly filled out. Makes it really challenging to ask these sort of fundamental questions about the world. Going back to the height and weight, I'm not 100% sure that they did an amazing job of that. Right? These are people who are just going about their job, maybe they're not as, maybe they let some people slouch and some people not. Like it's a real challenge. And you get this with other prison records where they'd write a physical description. So you have their height and their weight, and then they'll write like chubby. You're like, I know their height and weight. This person can't be chubby. Yeah. They're like 5'11" and 130 pounds. Like this, it's not physically possible to be chubby at the weight that you're talking about. Just an opinion
they had about that person. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you see some of the challenges with the records, I guess.
Yeah, that's so strange. Were they at that time? Would they have been actually weighing them, or are they just like that person looks like they're 130 pounds?
Don't know. I assume they weigh them. It's not a terribly hard thing to do.
Yeah.
But one of the ways that you could verify this is you could go back to the old prison records for what they purchased, and there should be a scale.
Right.
Yeah. Like if they're actually weighing someone, there should be a scale. Mm-hmm. And we've got most of their records. I haven't actually looked for a scale specifically. That's part of the work that I have to do still to come, is go through all the records. I'm really interested in what they fed people and like what experience was like in prison.
Yeah.
The Saskatchewan jails are not good. Yeah. I mean, like, you don't want to be in jail in the 19th century anyways, but Regina is so bad that people will take a longer sentence if they can just go to Prince Albert instead. Like they'll add a year to their sentence.
Wow.
And it was because Prince Albert was focused on rehabilitation. So like you could gain some skills, and Regina was just this like shithole.
It's really, really strange to try and put Prince Albert in my head as the progressive place in the province.
Yeah. Well, because it was new.
Yeah.
It was like a new, bigger facility. Regina was really small. But it is funny to think of Prince Albert in a different light.
Yeah. But yeah, it's so long ago that it's not something I've thought about before, so that's so interesting. And so, as you were talking about the height and weights of the indigenous populations going into prisons going down, as the colonials start coming, and that have you guys started looking at all on the other side that you were talking about the colonials, if their weights and heights were going up, or?
We've started. This work is still fairly ongoing, but Chris Inwood published a paper comparing BC's prisons and Saskatchewan's prisons, and looking at the height and weight of, I think, both Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. He's really, really interested in that. He's an economist, and so he does all the stats and all of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, one of the questions also is, I think the height and weight change is less interesting than the timing, right? Like if you can pin that moment where you can actually see the impact of colonial changes on people's bodies to a specific year or range of years, that's really, really interesting to me. Because a lot of the people that we're interested in don't leave behind detailed records. Whether we're talking about European settlers or Indigenous people, paper is expensive in the 19th century. People don't write down, Dear Diary, hungry again. I thought when I was starting out doing history that's what you'd see. People like writing their deepest secrets.
Yeah.
And talking about daily life. Most people don't write that in their diary. They'll write the weather really important to farming. So you keep records of on this day it was windy, sunny, maybe a temperature, things like that. But the only place you actually see people talking about their sort of real daily life is in their correspondence to family members. And those are really hit and miss. Lots of people didn't have a lot of money and so aren't sending correspondence, or even if they are, someone had to keep that for 150 years, right? Or until it got into an archive. And so we don't have a lot of records where people detail what they ate or, tough times, right? You're writing a letter to your family. You don't always tell them the truth, right? You could be really, really struggling and you want to put on a brave face and, make sure your family doesn't worry. And so getting at those people's experiences can be really challenging. And one of the ways you can do it is looking at these big macro trends across large sections of society. We might not be able to rebuild the individual experience, or maybe we can in a select few cases, but we can compare that to some of the big macro trends that we're seeing.
Do you have any hypotheses about the time frame and like what might have happened that if it does go in that direction where these heights and weights are going up of the Europeans? Do you have any ideas about?
Yeah, I've got some initial thoughts, and this one's going to be really tricky, because like the big challenge is you're dealing with prisoners. So these are people who are not doing well in general. Just on the whole, these people tend to be less likely to own property. Like we'd still need to rebuild exactly the differences between the prison population and the non-prison population. That's really challenging. And maybe one day I'll get the time and money to do that, because you'd have to link them all to the census. Right? The census will give you a sense of property ownership. It'll give you some other pieces. I think religion's in both. But yeah, property is what you'd be looking for. My general sense is that my expectation, I guess, is that you'd watch Indigenous health get much worse starting in about 1870.
Okay.
And that by the 1880s, children born in that decade and the one after, I would expect to see their height start to drop. You have mass starvation in 1883 or so, and you have a rolling series of hunger in the 1870s. So you'd expect that children who grow up in that 2-decade time span, that you'd start to watch their heights go down. And you'd expect to see adults have lower weights, right? But I haven't gone back and looked for that specifically in the prairie context.
Yeah. And so is there a goal afterwards to all this research, like to inform new policy today, or is it just to do kind of like a recap on this time period?
It's a bunch of different things. So one of the big things I want to know about, one is the timing of colonialism. Another is, once all of this is done, the records are under lock and key. They contain personal health information. Like they can't quite be shared yet. They're right on the cusp of that time period where these records become open to the public.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
There's privacy rules. And so once we're sort of done with it, it's going to the archive. And the archive will hold these until they can be available to the public. So
and that's after a certain amount of time?
A certain number of years. Yeah. And it's complicated by the fact that it includes health information, which has like a different window, and it includes children, right? I don't think any of the children are likely to be alive today. They would have been born, the last ones in our sample would be born in 1920, so they'd be now 100, 103. Yeah. Pretty unlikely, but there's set number of years or rules, and I think it might be 120 years.
Oh, okay.
I'd have to look back. Every province is a little bit different. And so the idea is, once we're done answering all of our questions, we're going to give this back to the archive so that no one ever has to do this work again, and that you could use these records in hundreds of different ways. So like I'm really interested in the marks on people's bodies, the rise of tattooing, workplace injuries. I'm really interested if you can see a rise in serious injuries after World War One.
Okay.
Right? And like what kinds of injuries? Do you see more amputations? Like that's what you'd expect to see. But frequently history doesn't play out quite that way.
Yeah.
One of the cool things that I was really surprised by was just how diverse the population who appears in these prisons are. You have people from almost every continent in the world. Australia, you have Africa, Europe, Asia, I think even South America.
Yes, I wouldn't have thought that either. Yeah.
No, and you think about the 19th century, it is not easy to cross the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
Right? It's not easy. Like I'm headed to Germany in a couple of weeks. It's still a pain, right? Like I'm going to spend probably 2 days in an airport.
Yeah.
You can imagine if you're doing this by boat, right? This is a time period where you could die on those boats, right? This is a non-trivial trip.
Yeah.
And yet you have people from all over the world who are congregating in Saskatchewan. And that sort of really changed my ideas about, I'm from Ontario, and I came to Saskatchewan for work thinking, that there'd be that would be a somewhat rural place, and it is a somewhat rural place, but it's also a place that's tied to all of these other countries, both historically and at present, right? It's got a large international population. It's got a large Indigenous population. It's actually quite a bit more cosmopolitan and diverse than my initial expectations. And it's kind of cool looking back in 1905 and seeing almost the same thing.
Yeah.
That in fact this is a province that is tied to all different parts of the world, and it has been for more than 100 years. That was one of my big surprises, I guess.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I would have never thought that, because I think about it that way myself. Like I've lived in Saskatoon my whole life, so I've always seen a diversity going around. But I would have never thought that it would have been diverse going that far back. I don't think many people even think about us that way now. I think Saskatchewan, it's not very well known to begin with, but people think of it kind of being this underpopulated place with this just farming communities.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Saskatchewan's population at the time period that I'm studying is about the same as it is today.
Oh, wow.
Like it actually grows really, really fast, and then it sort of remains similar. Like it goes up and down, it has booms and busts. But it grows surprisingly large early on, which was another thing that I was not expecting to see.
Yeah, that would be weird too, especially at that time. Like how fast can the population grow in like the 1860s, 1870s?
So it depends. So there's two ways that you grow. Well, three ways that you grow. One is you have less deaths, right? If less people are dying, your population just inherently grows. One is having more births, especially births that like don't immediately die.
Yeah.
And then the third and the most important for Canada at this time is immigration. So if you have 100,000 people joining, your birth rate doesn't really matter that much, right? Like if every year 100,000 people are coming, you can be bleeding people out due to deaths and other things. And so a lot of this is migration into the prairies, more than necessarily changes to births and deaths. And you can see this maybe most clearly in BC, where I've done a little bit of demographic work. In BC, circa like 1860, 1850, you have about 35,000, 45,000 Indigenous people. By the end of the century, you have about 10 to 15,000.
Wow.
So you're just watching that population just get slammed. Yeah. Just slammed. And at the same time, I'd have to look up the numbers, but it goes from something like a few thousand white settlers to like 1 million.
Sorry, that's BC?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you're just watching this just totally opposite set of trends. And it's not that the people in settlers in BC are just having crazy numbers of kids, right? Like there's a physical limit to how fast you can have kids. It's just you have movements of people from other parts of the world in. And so that's the big transformative power that I think a lot of people miss is if you just have more people, you get an enormous amount of power, right? You think about voting, you think about, just industrial production, property ownership, military strength, like all of that is tied very, very closely to just population.
Yeah.
Like population in a lot of ways is power. Not completely. There's lots of countries that have huge populations that aren't necessarily as successful on the world stage, but it's a big part, a big start, is just underlying population.
Like in the different provinces, them having different rates of increases in population, would a lot of that have been the quality of the advertising the province at those times, or do people kind of know beforehand, like I'm not going here, I'm going to BC? Or
yeah, so some of it's advertising, and some of it is the treaty process. So they don't put land up for sale until they have a treaty behind it in general. BC is a little bit different. It never really gets treaties, like starts the process and then stops them. But some of it's also just the presence of the railway. You don't, like if you plan to sell your crop to market, you do not want to cart it hundreds of miles, right? It's just not economically viable. And so proximity to railway becomes really, really important. I'm actually building a game on this right now.
Okay, cool.
So it's called Homesteaders.
Yeah.
And this game came out of a different project that was trying to have people think with historical examples about big global changes. So like climate change, industrialization, right? Like all of these things that change the world and its relationship to the environment. And so I'm working with Jim Clifford and a couple other people, but it's Jim's grant. And the idea became trying to use records from this time period to show actually how connected Saskatchewan is to the world around it. Saskatchewan's a challenging place to live. Like today is a beautiful, 0 Celsius day, but it gets down, -35 this winter before wind chill. It is a hard place to live. And that is amplified by the fact that there's not that many trees here. So if you want to keep your house warm in the 19th century, right, you don't have good insulation, right? You're burning wood. You're burning a lot of wood, and you're going to run out. And so one of the things that you might do is you might import coal, right? So now you need money, and you need to export, often wheat, right, just to sort of stay alive. And so it's kind of weird to think about, but that coal is coming from a lot of different places, but one of them might be Pennsylvania. These big coal fields in the United States. And you might be shipping your grain to Britain or the United States. And so like we think of Saskatchewan as this rural place, but it's built on these international markets to heat your home and to send wheat and other supplies out. They're shipping in, you can buy a house from the old Eaton's catalog and have it shipped in.
We have family that did that actually. Sears catalog,
Yeah. So like you think about these trains end up connecting. They sort of serve as the arteries that make this possible. So the game is about, you play as one of 10 or so different communities who are attempting to farm on the prairies. So there's a Cree family, there's a Doukhobor family, Ukrainian family, British families. There's some widows. Widows aren't really allowed to own land at this time. Women aren't allowed to own land, homestead at this time. But widows are if you had young children.
Right, okay.
And so the game has you play as these different characters. And every round you draw a card, you get a little bit of story, and you make a choice. And these are all choices built from like oral histories or archival evidence, or in some cases secondary sources. But they're real choices that real people faced. And you make these choices and you see what happens. And there's natural disasters and other things that you face. But everyone starts off at a totally different place, mimicking the sort of real world. Like some people came to the prairies super poor, and they buried 6 of their kids. Yeah. Right? Like it's just a horrible time. And if you get that character, I'm sorry, you're not going to have that much fun. You're just like the real person that character is based off. You get to bury all of your kids, one after another. And if you came to the prairies with quite a bit more, in general, you became more and more and more wealthy. If you started with land, then as people failed, you could buy up their sections. Right. And so the game sort of tries to create the system that people would have experienced. And one of the factors, going back to your earlier question, is how close you start to the railway. The people who start to the railway in this game do better. You can sell your crop for more money, and it tends to be a cycle. You get a little bit more money in Era 1, which lets you get through Era 2 easier and maybe pick up some more property, which lets you really excel in Era 3. And the people who struggled in Era 1 enter Era 2 with nothing. They struggle in Era 2. They hit Era 3 and they just keep getting pounded and pounded and pounded. Wow. And so the idea is, can we use games to simulate what people experienced historically so that you can see some of the patterns that people would have experienced? And it's really cool watching students play this game. It's still being developed. It still needs quite a bit of work.
Will it be publicly available at any point? Or?
I don't know. I don't know. We've got money to do sort of like a custom publishing. I don't know if we'll ever sell it to a publisher. But the goal is, we're sort of getting down the rules and all those pieces. The goal is to give it to the world. At some point. Like it's mostly going to be interesting to people in Saskatchewan, but I'd love to play it in the high schools. Yeah. It's cool. Like in the going back to our first conversation, games are one of the ways that you transmit knowledge to children. So they can understand these really complicated big ticket items that are really important to society. So one of the big questions in the game is, how much do your choices matter? And does that change depending on certain situations?
Yeah, circumstance versus okay.
Yeah, and so you can. It's like not that good to just tell people that, right? It's not that useful. But if you can have them experience like real choices where you don't know the answer, I think people become a lot more empathetic to the people in the past, and I hope more empathetic to people today.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, I think, yeah.
Where you realize that people do not make choices with perfect information. They do not get to choose all of the things that they might want.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the characters is a black family. And they have a choice at one point late in the game to send their daughter or son, I guess it would be son, to law school. Son desperately wants to go to law school, which is a real historical challenge that parents had. But you don't have the money, and if your son leaves, you lose their labor. And so you're going to be able to take less actions in the game. And the game is set up in a way that it would be very, very, very hard to make that choice.
Yeah.
Right? Morally, it's probably the choice you want to make. But logistically, you might be going through a really rough winter where part of your family starves.
You don't know that beforehand. Right?
And you don't know that. You just know that you desperately need your son's labor, and you're so short on money that the winter is just going to be brutal. You don't know how brutal, but you know it's not going to be good. And so almost no one makes that choice. They make the choice to keep their son on the farm, which is a choice that many people historically had to make. And so you get to see these tough choices that people make. And another really interesting choice in the game is you're really struggling. You're playing as a widow, you have very little money, you have very little friends, and a neighbor comes by and asks you to sign a petition. And you have an inclination that the petition is pretty racist. It's about keeping foreigners out. Your character doesn't have a stake one way or another in this. And you know that if you sign this petition, someone else probably gets hurt. But you also know that if you don't sign the petition, you're going to piss off one of your only possible friends in the whole game, and you desperately, desperately need their help. And trying to give that sense of how discrimination spreads through a society, often through sort of ambivalence and other things, and trying to present that as an actual choice that students have to make.
Yeah,
you don't have to do one thing or another. Like, you have the choice. But some choices are harder to make than others, and they come at real costs to either you or someone else.
Yeah.
And you don't know. You don't know exactly how that's going to play out.
And you said that all of these decisions are real decisions that you found looking back. And do you think that I wonder if, like, I would imagine, but how much harder do you think it makes the decisions on the students as they're playing it, knowing that, like, they're essentially playing through somebody else's real life? It's not that, like, you didn't come up with the conflicts. There were ones that existed already.
Yeah, well, I think it's really cool watching students play. Like, I thought this game would only be for about 10 people, right? Each person gets a character, you make your choice. I think it's actually the worst way to play the game, having watched students in all different group sizes. The most interesting groups are groups of 3 students or so. Like, they read the choice out loud, and then you just watch them debate. And they're like, oh, but if we do that, this might happen. And they pick up so many different things. Like, they've seen... The cool thing about basing off real historical choices is they see things in that I missed. Like, they came to different conclusions about what the lessons what lessons the game teaches than I had initially tried to put in the game.
Wow, that's got to be really cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. And, not all the characters... Some of the characters are based on, like, a single person. Some of them are based on 2 people who had a similar life and then diverged at points. A few are composite characters. So, 8 or 10 different stories are sort of amalgamated into one because we didn't have enough information on a single person.
Right.
But one of the big takeaways that students picked up on that I didn't intend to put in the game, but I guess made it in just because of these real historical choices, was how often your choices didn't matter to your outcome.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Right? Like, if you were born poor and you started with nothing, that you spent your life in just this punishing cycle of poverty. And you had choices, and the choices mattered, but they didn't get you out of that cycle. And that for the characters who started with a lot, you could make almost any choice you wanted, and there'd be better and worse choices, and you would suffer or not. But you never got quite as poor as the people who started poor.
Wow.
And like I said, that wasn't anything that I intended to put in the game. But when you start building it off of people's biographies, you get to watch, like you can choose between two different jobs, but they pay roughly the same, right? But if you have tens of thousands of dollars, you can invest in property or other things. It's probably going to be okay. And so it was just really cool seeing students pick up on those lessons when you give them sort of an open sort of playground of simulations. So a lot of my games are kind of like that, where I sort of started with an initial idea, but my goal is to mimic a system, like a historical setting, and figure out from there what students are learning.
Yeah, that's amazing. I've heard artists say before that sometimes as they're drawing or painting or creating music that they start and it becomes organic. It's got its own life and it starts growing itself. Do you find that with your board games as you're making them, or your games as you're making them, that they're kind of, you've got this idea and then it just rolls and rolls and rolls into something?
A little bit. Like I fail a lot,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Like some of the games I built are not worth playing, or they taught a different lesson than the one I was setting out to teach.
Okay.
Like this game, when we were building it, was meant to teach about sort of humans' relationship to the environment. And it's probably least good at that. It ended up being much better at teaching about colonialism and railroads and all of these other things. Like it has pieces of my original vision. But I sort of came up short in some of the initial goals. And it was organic in the sense that I wanted this game to be useful in the classroom, which means you have really tight requirements. So the first game I built, which was about smuggling, I nailed those requirements. You can explain the game in like 10 minutes. You can play the game in like 25 minutes. So in a 50-minute section, you have some time at the end to discuss it. And in an hour and 20-minute section, you have a lot of time to discuss the game. And the discussion is where a lot of the learning happens. This game on homesteading is just terrible as a classroom game. So it takes about 20 minutes to explain. You can get through the first era in about 35 minutes.
Oh, so this is going to be multiple sessions.
It takes multiple sessions. Either you need a 3-hour class or two. You can play the game with no discussion or limited discussion in two 50-minute sections. And if you have two 70-minute sections, you can play the game and have a good discussion. Or if you have a 3-hour time block. So I totally missed my mark.
Yeah, right.
Totally missed my mark. And what had happened was I realized that the discussions that students were having were more important than a lot of the other things. And so you could cut them. Like you just say, oh, one person per character, and the game goes pretty fast. But like the learning wasn't happening.
Right.
And it's like, well, that defeats the whole purpose of this game. And so the length of the game expanded. We added a bunch of global events that happen that tie people together. There's now a lot of interaction between players where as the indigenous person loses land, that doesn't just disappear into the ether, that actually goes to someone else. And so you can watch the transfer of property between people. The people who are struggling can try and work wage labor jobs for the people who are succeeding. Like trying to create that system, all of that ends up taking a lot more time and requires more rules and all of that. But at the end of the day, the goal is to learn. I can figure out the classroom dynamics. It'd be better if it was, if I'd kept to the requirements better, but I wasn't succeeding in the goals, these sort of educational goals. And so it sort of developed organically.
Yeah. Would you find that that's the hardest part is like, cause I imagine if you want, like I've never built a game, but I would imagine that it's easy to just keep filling it with more and more stuff that you want. But if you need a game to fit into 120 minutes or whatever the class length is, I would think that that'd be the hardest part. Is like, okay, like now you're really thinking about the stuff you got to leave out and not what you add, right?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely hard. Like the game is done when you can't cut anything more.
Yeah.
Right, like that's how you know it's done. I think the hardest part for me, like that's definitely hard, is how diverse the audience is. So some of the people who play this game in a classroom love games. Games are their life. And they are very good. And this game is very simple in comparison to the games they play, like Civilization. You know, like my game can be explained in 20 minutes. Like it's not that complicated. And then you have people who this might be their first or second game that they've played. They played Candyland or something like that. And it really threw me off when I had to explain the game to people who had never played games in their life. Like, I can explain this to people, like the friends who I game with, in 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah, right.
So like, it's a resource track. You know what those are. Take your actions. Like, I don't even know that I'd have to explain the game.
They would just figure it out.
It's like, draw a card. This is the order. You draw one of these, 3 of these, one of these, 3 of these, one of these, 3 of these. These ones are choices. These ones aren't. Adjust your tracks. Let's go. Mm-hmm. That's the whole game. Like, 1 minute. And what's really, really interesting is watching people who don't play the game. Many of them make all kinds of mistakes in the rules, of course, right? They're learning. But what's really cool to me is they can mess up the rules horribly.
Okay.
Like, just accidentally cheat in like the worst possible ways.
Yeah.
And they will still somehow end up with the core message that I was aiming for.
Wow.
And I think it's because as you're reading people's stories, like real stories from people's lives, you can't help but not pick up some of the sort of trajectory of their life, even if all of the mechanics get jumbled up. Mm-hmm. Like, I had one student who misunderstood some of the rules and was like buying and selling. They thought when there's an action you take that was originally listed as sell your labor, as in like wage labor, but they thought they were literally selling off their children.
Okay.
Like,
yeah.
they just...
So you're a labor force.
Yeah. But they were also somehow accidentally gaining labor in ways they shouldn't. And so like, they made 2 mistakes, catastrophic mistakes in opposite directions, and ended up with the exact score, the average score for that character.
Wow,
and everything worked out, and they had a great time, and they learned all of these lessons. And so that really surprised me, that you could have people really bungle the rules or misunderstand and still learn a lot about history. And that's, I think, super, super interesting and cool.
That is cool too. I wonder, do you think it was because they made a mistake, like they made complementary mistakes that they ended up
so that helped?
Yeah.
But I think it's because, like, on each of the cards, you're just reading a part of someone's life. And so even if you end up richer than you should be or poorer than you should be, I think there's just something more powerful in reading snippets and reading hard choices that people are presented with. I think that's just more powerful than I thought. And I'm getting more and more convinced that games are one of the better ways to teach history.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'd definitely believe that. Do you find that they, like, as you're talking about them reading these snippets from people's lives, or do the students make decisions based on trying to work their mind into the character's mind, or do you think they're trying to make their own decisions? I don't know if that question makes sense, but
yeah, a little bit of both. So one of the things I like the most about watching people play games is when they decide to make moral choices that will have them lose the game. Right.
That's weird. Yeah.
Right. Because if you're playing the game as a game, you never make that choice. But if the game has caught you in a visceral sense and you're like, I will never do that. Right. That to me is the magic. Mm-hmm. And so I've seen this in one commercial game and then a game, the Homesteader game. So in the commercial game, there's a game called Freedom Underground Railway. So it's about slavery in the United States and people on the Underground Railway going to Canada.
Okay.
And I was playing with a couple of my friends, and you know how you score points. It's very, very clear. And we were presented with an opportunity to score more points by letting one slave go back into slavery and getting a few more across the border. It was the correct play in the game. It was just worth more points. Mm-hmm. And someone I was playing with said, no, never going to happen. I will not send someone back into knowingly send someone back into slavery. I don't care about the points. Weird. We're not making that choice. Right. In a visceral sense, had decided that this was more than just a game about points. They were sort of captivated by the moral choices that they're making. I saw something similar in Homesteaders, where the community that was playing as the African-American community from Oklahoma realized that they had a difficult set of choices. If they wanted to complete their goal in this game, which is based on clearing a certain amount of land, they had to make choices that they were uncomfortable with. I can't remember the exact choice they were making, but I think it had to do with their children. it might have actually been, in order to hit that goal, they had to voluntarily starve for one of the winters.
Okay.
And that probably meant burying a child. And they said, no, we don't need that land. We're going to make sure our family is taken care of. We're essentially going to abandon our homestead. And the cool thing is that's a choice that real people made. Right? A lot of African American communities decided that homesteading just wasn't working out. Like you're on like the verge of failure at every moment.
Yeah, right.
And so a lot of them just leave and become railroad porters and other jobs because they prioritize their family's safety and success over necessarily land ownership. And so it's really, really cool to see students making a similar choice. It wasn't meant to be in the game, but they're making essentially the same choice that historic populations did.
Yeah. I wonder do you think that maybe it's, because, how do I ask this? Like, do you think that maybe the students when they're playing don't want to, like, they're afraid of portraying themselves as somebody that's only rational? And so it's, because it's a lot of the times, like you said, like, for example, with sending your son that wants to be a lawyer to school, that you would really like to make that decision, but you need hands on the homestead. And I guess I've got a question in my mind, but I'm having a hard time phrasing it. Like, I guess, do you think that the students are making these moral decisions, one, because they're people and they're moral, but they're also afraid of coming across as people that are cold to the rest of the players of the game?
It's every student is different. Some students, I think that is true. Other students role play in the opposite direction. Like some of the rich characters just make like fairly offensive comments about other people's poverty, and will just be like, oh, yeah, well, you should have played better. Even though it's very, very clear that they started with $30 and someone else started with $1.
Yeah.
Right? Like they just had fundamentally different opportunities. But it's really interesting seeing people sort of role-playing that coldness in a way that I wasn't expecting. Right? And they're doing it in sort of a playful way and whatnot. But
yeah. So it goes both ways.
It goes both ways. And some people, especially the gamers in the group, they count points. And they will do everything to get the most points they can because that's how they're used to playing.
Yeah.
The people who don't necessarily game as often, I think, approach it much more from sort of the moral choice point of view and use the game as a simulation. And if they get a lot of points, whatever. But they want to make the right choices, like in a moral sense.
Yeah.
But when you do it with a group of 3, now you have to balance those because not everyone in the group may think the same. And that's where I think you get those really wonderful conversations where people talk about what is the right choice and how do you know? And the game, most of your choices, you don't know the outcome. You have some guesses, but is calling for a doctor going to save your child who's sick? Or should you just save the money? And who knows, maybe your child gets better, maybe it doesn't. You don't know if that doctor is going to pay out. And so like just your whole set of choices are based on partial information, which is what the choices that humans are presented with. Yeah.
Yes. It's particularly real, right? I'd imagine too, the intimacy of 3 people versus 10 is probably a big factor too, because you might not care about the 10th person's opinion as much as you do the 3rd person, Yeah. So group size. So like 1 person per group is too few. Once you get above 6, it gets really loud and I think people start disengaging. Yeah.
So I think the sweet spot is between 2 and 4 people, which really surprised me because this is a game that has like a fair bit of reading and like you can't fit 4 people around. Like these are little like poker sized cards.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just going to mean that the game could play 2 people at most, 2 people sitting side by side, sharing a card, reading. But the fact that you can just read out loud just makes it fit 4 people really well. Once there's more than about 60 people in the classroom, it gets a little noisy. And you need a microphone if you're running the game. But I was blown away at how many people could play this game simultaneously, which is really, really interesting.
That is interesting. And so how big are your class sizes? Like how many students are you trying to organize into groups for these things?
Yeah, so it depends. So we've played it with 60 people in one room. We've played it with as few as about 8 people.
Okay.
And we've played it in some really large courses that had seminars. So Jim Clifford, who's helping to build the game, just finished playing it on Friday with, I think, 6 straight seminars. So each seminar had about 20 people. Maybe he did more. I think he played it with about 180 people.
Wow. These 6 seminars back to back?
Back to back. Wow. So we had to explain the rules. I got sick, and so I wasn't able to help him. I feel terrible. I'll join him this Friday, I think, and see if I can't help take some of the load off his back, because explaining the game 6 times in a row, it's hard to be excited with the last time.
Yeah.
And we often bring in a second or third person to help run the game, just because it's tiring.
Yeah, that's a lot of work. Like, just cognitively, you're doing a lot, right?
Yeah. And we're playing it with education students and history students. I'm really interested in how people at different career stages or with different levels of knowledge learn. So we played it with a bunch of profs, and like they immediately pick up on all the themes and like everything we were going for, like in like 6 seconds. And then we played it with a bunch of education students who aren't used to thinking historically. Many of them have never taken a history class. They're in a class about wellness. Like, this game talks a lot about wellness. And it's interesting watching them go through the game. They reach just fundamentally different sets of conclusions because they come from a different place, right? They don't have a background in prairie farming or environmental history or, things like that.
Yeah.
They haven't spent 20 years of their life studying this. And yet they get a different set of lessons out of it. And so I'm really curious, I guess, what that's going to be like when you go to a different level. Like, I've played with undergraduates, graduate students, and professors. What happens when you go to high school? Right? Does that change? Right? Not only do you have a different knowledge of history, but you have a different sort of emotional state.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? Does this game just totally fall apart? Will students be interested? Right? I have no idea until we actually get in the room. And that's kind of the cool and terrifying thing about running games is you fail a bunch. We've had to change the game recently because I made a rule that was too complicated. I thought it was super simple.
Yeah, right.
It was not.
Yeah.
Right? And then you have to refabricate every one of your components, which, is like 30 cards a character. That's 300 plus cards that you need to remanufacture. So it's really painful when you mess up.
Yeah, because it's like a web, right? Everything's connected. Yeah. Wow.
And just little things, all sorts of little challenges that you run into. The other game that I built, the first successful game I built was one called Policing the Sound, which is about British Columbia. So I study the border. It's kind of weird. We've talked about everything but the border, even though that's like the main thing that I do. But this was a game that I designed to teach people about smuggling.
Okay.
And one of the big challenges that I had when teaching was that people would look back on people in the past without the kind of empathy that I thought people in the past deserved. And so they would look back at the past and be like, oh, that person's a criminal. I would never do that. Right? I'm an upstanding member of society. Like, I would never commit a crime. That's just not the case. Right? Like, the world doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Like, why do we have prisons if that's the case? And so the idea was to try and let people interact with the system that encouraged smuggling. So this is based on old 19th century customs records. It was based on like the actual history and the sort of experiences. And so you essentially play as a merchant from 8 or 10 different communities. And you can bring goods into the country legally, you can smuggle them, and each good gives you a different amount depending on if you smuggle or bring it in. So opium, for example, it is worth very little if you bring it in legally. You're allowed to bring opium in at this time, but the taxes on it are really, really high.
Okay.
And so if you smuggle it, you get like 3 times more money.
Yeah.
And then over the course of the game, Chinese immigration becomes illegal. And so you can start smuggling people.
Did that actually happen?
Oh,
okay, wow.
So starting in 1882, the United States starts prohibiting most kinds of Chinese immigration. And in 1888, they make it really severe. And so this is the story about, and entering Canada required a head tax over time. So you could do it, but it got more and more and more expensive. And so there's anti-Chinese riots in Washington State and California. Like, it becomes a really sort of sad and dark part of American history. So anyways, this game is about that, and about the smuggling of people across borders and the smuggling of goods. And so the game begins, I guess the last thing you need to know is, in the 19th century, when you were a customs officer, if you captured more cargo, you got more money as your salary.
Wow.
So that's how you're sort of paid.
Yeah.
So you're really incentivized to catch a lot of stuff. And so
definitely.
The communities in the game are big and small, like New Westminster, Bellingham Bay, but also like Haida Gwaii, like really North British Columbia. A lot of the indigenous people would come down for short periods of time. And so on your turn, you have a hand of cards of goods. You get to put them down. It's hidden, so no one can see what you're doing. And then the customs inspector searches one community. And at the start, they sort of pick randomly. And then everyone tells publicly how much money they earned. And it becomes very clear that some people are smuggling. It'll be like 5, 6, 7, 38.
Yeah.
It's like, that seems suspicious to me. And each community can bring a different amount of cargo. So a lot of the smaller communities only are bringing 2 items, and the big communities with big ports are bringing 5. And so the game is set up so that the customs inspector can search anyone they want, but they know very quickly that in order to win the game, they only want to be searching one of the big 3 or 4 communities, because if they catch them even just once smuggling, it's like 50 points.
Yeah.
And if they catch one of the small communities, it's worth like 5 points. And so that sort of mirrors what actually happens in the past, which is the customs inspectors ignored indigenous people who are smuggling. They ignored small communities because they didn't have enough personnel, and their salaries are tied to catching big shipments.
Yeah.
So you're focused on the major port cities, because if you can catch just one of those, it might make your whole salary for a year.
Yeah.
And so at the start of the game, maybe 1 or 2 communities smuggle. By the 3rd round of the game, everyone is smuggling.
Yeah, they're all doing it, yeah.
Everyone realizes that there's not enough customs inspectors to guard them. And even if they get caught once, the amount of money they're making from smuggling is just so much more than they'd make by doing it legitly. And so at the end of the game, it's kind of cool where you're like, well, why are all of you criminals? You terrible people. And it's a chance for us to talk about the challenges of the archive. This is based on customs records. And that's kind of a shitty record to base smuggling off of, right? It's like me, right? They suck at their job, right? If you got caught, you suck at your job.
Yeah.
And so we get to talk about archives and absences, right? The people who are good at smuggling are never going to appear in the archive, and I can't put them in my game, right? We have no records of them because they're good at what they do.
Yeah, wow.
Right? And so we can talk about these big ticket items in history, about absences of records and the challenges of rebuilding clandestine activities. But we can also talk about the ways that customs officials selectively targeted people or not, the kinds of choices people made, right? Illegal in law, but socially accepted at that time, right? One of the sort of funny stories is, if you were smuggling, you could have your ship seized and it would be auctioned. But in practice, no one from the community would bet against you, and you buy back your ship for like $5, right? Because it's like, we break the law all the time. Like, think jaywalking. Like, how many people jaywalk or break minor laws? And so it's a chance to talk about which laws are important in a given time period or place.
Yeah.
Smuggling in a different place amongst a different community would feel very differently than in British Columbia, where there's sort of a belief that trade needs to happen across the Canada-US border, and that these laws are oppressive, and you're probably not going to get caught anyways. And there's a lot of money to be made. So it's sort of a cool chance to talk about complex ideas about morality and about law and about, like I said, absences and records.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really funny about the, like, how do you build stories and techniques around smugglers that were never caught. So,
yeah, it's a cool challenge.
Yeah.
And so that game, like I said, was much more successful in that it actually plays in a 50-minute time period. And that one's based around commercially available game called Sheriff of Nottingham, which is a game about smuggling, but it's like in the Robin Hood era.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And so like the basic mechanics of selecting a few goods and either bringing them or smuggling is very similar. But you can change the ratios, you can change the amounts, you can change how the customs inspector acts to make it actually feel quite historical.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of cool thinking of taking a commercial off-the-shelf game and repurposing and changing and modifying and everything to make it work historically. That's sort of how I started building games. And then the new game is sort of the mechanics are completely new.
Okay. So was that your first one then? Sorry? I don't know if you said that already.
Yeah.
Yeah. Using the sound. And then is that kind of what started your interest in the Canada-US border, or were you looking at it before this game?
Yeah, so I was interested in the Canada-US border long before I started thinking that games could be a part of what I do.
Mm.
So like the easy way to think about this is that this was just a factor of my birth. So I was born a dual citizen, Canada-US, and as a child I moved back and forth across the border almost every year to live. So I was born in Lethbridge. I moved to Minneapolis. I think I moved to Victoria, Minneapolis, Guelph, Ontario, Toronto, Minneapolis, and then Guelph. And I stayed there for a while. And then I did my PhD in California.
Mm-hmm.
And then I moved back here. And in addition to all of that, like moving for like home, I would make summer trips from Ontario to California almost every year. So like a month or more of the year I'd be in the United States. And so my whole life I've crossed the border. And you would think that's where I became interested in the border. But in reality, I got a summer job working with Chris Inwood, the person I'm working with prisons with now.
Okay.
Digitizing the Canadian census. Like the worst, most boring work you can think of.
Yeah, right.
Right, like it's literally like you get old 19th century handwriting and you're like, John McDonald, farmer, Ronald McDonald, farmer, right? Just like line by line, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And as part of that though, Chris was a really thoughtful mentor, and he gave quite a few different people a chance to do sort of side projects. And no one, when they're young, is like, I'm going to grow up to be a census historian, right? Like the most boring of all things. But I realized, and this is where I sort of fell in love with history, like for real, was how much you could figure out with sources that I never thought of looking at. Mm-hmm. And so I became really interested in whether or not you could use the census to measure how people cross the border, right? So you could find someone in the United States Census, and the Canadian-US censuses are almost the same year. They were supposed to be the same year, but Canada got delayed. And so all of our censuses were supposed to be on like 1860, 1870, 1888.
Yeah.
But they were too slow when they set up the first one. So they're now like 71, 81, 91.
Okay, yeah.
But this means that if someone moved between those two places, it's not perfect, right? You have 10-year gaps between the markers, so someone could cross and then cross back and you'd miss them.
Yeah.
But you can capture some long-term mobility. And the other cool thing is it's very hard to rebuild the lives of women in the past. They didn't create as many records, less likely to end up in the courts. Like there's lots of records, but not as many as you'd think. You have diaries and family correspondence. But the census is one of the only places where you actually know more about women than you know about men. Because you know where all of their children are born. And you don't know that the husband was there for each of those births. But you know the wife was.
Yeah.
Right? Like, she's given birth to those children.
Yeah.
Like, you know where she is each of those days.
Yeah.
And if you have 10 kids, like you might in the 19th century, you know where that person was born. You know 8 or 10 moments of their life where they're located because they're children. And you probably can figure out where they died. Mm-hmm. And so you can actually watch people move around with the census in ways that I had never really thought of before.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And so I did a bunch of work with that, and I was really interested in tracing mobility, especially Indigenous mobility across the border. And so I set out to do my PhD on that. I was like, I'm going to be a census historian. Yeah. And it's funny, I spent tons and tons of time trying to rebuild how people appear in the census and using it to track mobility. And I got partway through that work, And as I was doing that, I realized that I didn't really understand how the border worked. And so I was like, okay, minor detour. Let's figure out how this border was built and how it operates. Because every time I'd look in a different place or at a different community, it seemed to just be a different border. And I was very, very confused. And so in the end, my dissertation has zero amount on the census. It became just an appendix at the end, didn't even make the main part. And the whole thing was me just figuring out how the Canada-US border was built and why it looked so differently for different groups.
Mm-hmm.
You'd see moments where where someone, it didn't even factor into their life. They'd be like, oh, I'm gonna go for breakfast, and they cross the border, and they're like, oh, but the better restaurant's on the other side of the border. I'm gonna go there for lunch, and like you get that, and then you get people whose entire lives are ruined in some way, shape, or form by the border. Either they end up in jail for a long period of time due to policing, or someone swindles them out of money and then crosses the border and can't be prosecuted. Right? Like hundreds of different moments, or someone wishes to divorce them. In Canada, really, really hard to get divorced in the 19th century. Like you need like an order of parliament. In the States, divorce really easy. And so they're right next door. And so many people will just cross the border and say, we're divorced.
Okay, yeah.
And we'll remarry. And one country will recognize that and the other one won't. And so you get these people who are stranded because they can't remarry unless they also cross the border. So you get this like weird people getting sort of trapped, I guess, by this border. And I became really, really interested in how and why that process emerged. And so that became my first book. And that was sort of what my PhD was on, was how do you build a border in the first place?
Yeah, that's so interesting. What was your first book called?
It's called A Line of Blood and Dirt.
Actually, you know what? I already added it to my list. Yeah, I remember looking at it this morning, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of cool. It's got an audio book. It's done better than I had ever expected.
Yeah. This is a fascinating topic too. Like you talk about how it affected some people differently and others not at all. And was it I've heard too that the Canada-US border in particular, I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, but that it was kind of like very fluid for a long time. It wasn't really set in stone. It was kind of this weird line that people weren't always sure about.
Yeah, and that comes down to how hard it is to guard a border this big. You know, like even today, I'm confident that you and I, if we were dedicated, could cross the border illegally.
Yeah.
Right? We fly up to Alaska, Yukon, toss on some skis or some snowshoes. There's a good chance we're getting through.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we try and cross at one of the Detroit-Windsor border, like one of the big crossings. Right? There's a lot of scrutiny. But people get across this border, right? Especially in the prairies, you know, like you see people dying making that crossing, right? You go out into the wilderness, you cross far away from a road, you know, and that's with satellites. Like we have satellites and infrared and fencing and all of this stuff, cars, like. It's a lot easier to guard this border today than it was in the 19th century, where you have a couple guys on horseback trying to guard a border that's 5,000 kilometers long, right? Like it's nonsense. And so it's kind of interesting. In the 19th century, the border is marked by piles of stone.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Like 3 kilometers apart, just like piles of stone, sometimes like an obelisk or something like that.
Yeah.
And they had to cut down the trees so you could see these piles of stone. Otherwise, you would literally skip them. But trees have this awful habit of growing back, right? Like that's what trees like to do. And so we still do this to this day. We have to clear cut, X number of meters on either side of the border. And the other challenge they had in the 19th century is, so you put all these piles of stone across the prairies, and they put them there in the 1870s. Bison and cows really like those piles of stone. They get all itchy, and then you got this nice pile of stones, and so they rub against them. And so they decimate the monuments pretty quickly. Yeah, right. And so borders, we sort of think of them as, you make them once. You have to keep making them over and over and over again. You have to keep putting the physical stones. You have to keep cutting the trees in order for that border to stay visible, because the natural world will destroy a border really quickly. Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you hold that thought? I gotta use the washroom.
Yeah, please.
Sorry to interrupt you. No. It's getting hard to focus here.
Yeah.
All right. So you were saying that animals are rubbing up against the stones, the trees are growing back, so the border's not, you gotta keep making it?
Yeah, so the physical infrastructure of borders is really expensive. You have to really, really want a border. And certain kinds of border control in the 19th century are easy. So if you want to guard against smuggling, that's actually really comparatively easy to do. Because every time you seize cargo, you make money. Every time you charge customs tariffs, you bring in way more than that person's salary is worth, right? It's not really well known, but when Canada was first founded, so you're thinking 1860s to World War I, and the same with the United States until about the same point, almost like the vast majority of the government's money is coming from customs and tariffs.
Okay.
It's not property tax or income fees. It's coming mostly from customs or the fees that government agencies are charging for their services. But that means it's really easy to justify more customs personnel, right? Because the more people you add, you're actually adding money to the government, right? They just capture more money. It's really hard to want to do other kinds of border control. So immigration really, really small until the turn of the century, because it's money that you could have spent on something else. You don't make money off policing immigration, you blow money on immigration. And so you get this really uneven border control where customs is huge, this powerful entity, and other kinds of things like the Northwest Mounted Police, relatively small. Like Canada has this, the Northwest Mounted Police are really weird in that they're like the police plus the customs officers plus the justice of the peace. Like they serve like this catch-all, like it's just essentially the Canadian administrator.
Right.
In the States, there's a little bit more differentiation, but it's kind of interesting to think about borders in that way, where certain kinds of things, certain kinds of motions get policed decades earlier than other kinds. So in this case, the movement of goods becomes really heavily policed long, like 40 years before the movement of people gets policed in the same way.
Okay. And so, with that, like, when did immigration enforcement start growing then? If they're not, like you said, they're spending revenue on increasing immigration but gaining it on customs, was there ever, like, when did the swing start becoming more towards immigration?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question. So there had been immigration restriction at a sort of local or state level from the beginning of immigration. Like they're worried about paupers, like people who are poor. They're worried about people who are diseased entering. And so you have some initial immigration inspection that is easy to do. And the reason it's easy is all you have to do is guard port cities, right? If you're thinking about all the people coming from Europe, it has to be a port big enough to fit a ship that can go across the ocean. There's not that many places you have to guard. They're not going to stop at some small place and let people out. Like your ship just can't dock properly.
Yeah.
And so it's really easy to guard a port. Just put a person in, a couple people, and they're just when all you're looking for is like, are you totally poor? You just have someone show you money and be like, next. You let them in, yeah. And disease is a little bit more complicated, but if someone is like horribly sick, it's obvious. Like they're like, oh, that person's dying. Yeah. Like maybe don't let them in, right? But more complex things like, is this person Chinese as opposed to Mongolian or Thai or Japanese, right? When you're trying to make those kinds of determinations in 10 seconds, those get really tough. Or, is this person a prostitute? Or is this person pregnant, right? Easy to tell at the end of a pregnancy, but what about a month into a pregnancy? Right? How do you tell that? And so they come up with all these like crazy ways of trying to justify their decision. So if a woman's hair wasn't lustrous enough, it would sort of become dull. Maybe that's a sign of an undetected pregnancy, right? Totally crazy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right? But they'd flag someone, set them aside for those kinds of things. And so when you're guarding immigration, right, you have very, very few people. And so they're trying to simplify the process by targeting only certain kinds of people, and they're just waving everyone through. And so that process begins early, But the real sort of start of immigration policy, the way we know it, probably is about 1882. So that's when you start having the hard policing against Chinese immigrants. And that's the first time that they're having to confront these more complicated questions where, you know, people are entering and they're like, oh, I'm not Chinese, I'm Mexican.
Yeah.
I'm Mongolian, I'm, you know, whatever. And if the person took any amount of time to learn 10 words of that language, how are you going to know without really setting someone aside and going through hours and hours of interviews?
Yeah.
And you don't have the personnel for that a lot of the time. And so early on, they guard port cities and they leave almost the entire border unguarded in terms of movement of people. And this becomes a real challenge with Chinese immigration, where Canada gets accused of profiting off of this policy. So like I said, Canada had a head tax. So, you know, every Chinese immigrant who wanted to come to Canada had to pay $50 to $500 depending on the year.
Wow, that's a lot back then.
Yeah. Wow. So like $500 is like 2 years' salary for someone who's doing like wage labor.
Yeah,
it's a lot. Like at that point, it's prohibitive. But so you'd have people come into Canada, but their goal is to get into the United States. And the rule around Chinese exclusion is that if you're caught, that you are sent back to the country from whence you came. And if you came from China to the States, they're going to send you back to China. But if you go from China to Canada into the United States, they send you back to Canada, which is great because then you just recross again.
Yeah.
And if you get sent back, you just recross again. It's not hard. And to the added frustration of the United States, each time they do this, Canada insists that the United States pay its head tax. Right? So now you have people who are crossing, they may cross 3 or 4 times, and the United States is forced to pay that head tax 3 or 4 times, which by the time it gets up to, you know, $500 it's oppressive. It's a crazy amount of money.
Yeah.
And so the United States gets really, really frustrated, and you start seeing changes in the immigration system. The other really interesting thing about trying to police people is it actually first starts with a customs agency. So I mentioned customs agency, really, really strong and powerful. And so when they're starting to police Chinese immigration for the first time, it's given to that department, not immigration.
Wow. Okay.
Because they want it to be spread out. And so very quickly it becomes clear that customs has other things they need to be doing. And so they start hiring dedicated Chinese inspectors. And that's sort of what happens in 1888, I think, is they realize that they need to fund this better if they want to actually guard against people. But there's like a lot of the challenges that we face and a lot of the shape of the border is actually set by those early limitations. So one of the things that in the 19th century that customs agents and immigration agents realize is guarding a border at the line itself is a losing game. All someone has to do is get through once and you're done.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the border's too long, you don't have enough personnel, it's not that hard to cross. And so what they do is they change the way the game is played. And this has ramifications to this day. So instead of trying to catch you at the moment you cross the border, which is hard, they instead make you justify your presence in the country every day that you live there. So to give you an example of how that plays out, if you want a job in Canada or the United States today, you need a social insurance number or a social security number.
Right.
If you want access to healthcare, you need a health card. Right? A lot of the things that the reason you might enter the country for are gated by other kinds of identification. And if you don't have those things, it's like, okay, you've successfully gotten into the country, but you can't get a good job, right? Maybe you're washing dishes under the table or something. You're worried about going to a hospital for basic medical care, right? And in many ways, the goal became, instead of trying to stop people at the line itself, control the risks and the benefits that someone thought they could gain by making that crossing.
Yeah, right.
And this is one of the big challenges if we're going back to the problem with historical records, is I can see the number of people who are turned away at the border, but I can't see the number of people who were discouraged and never made that journey in the first place. And I know from people's diaries that they're making decisions. So like a cool example is This guy writes back to his family and is like, don't send me a Christmas presents this year. The tariff on them was too high. Right? Wow. Don't waste your money. I'll come visit you or something. Right? So that record of his family not sending a present that year would never appear because there's no record. The only reason we know is he happened to write in his diary or into a letter back to his family about that. And so we get these glimpses of the power that the border can have to discourage certain kinds of movements, either people moving or transferring money, sending gifts. You can also see the way it changes people's stance on charity. So there's one community who is quite poor, looks around, and they want food. And so they send a message to their sister who's, I think in Washington State, saying, hey, in your last letter, you wrote that you were throwing away food because you couldn't find a market to it. We could really use some food. Like if we paid the train car, could you just send me like a bunch of that stuff?
Yeah.
Like we're really not doing well. But their concern about the border meant that they didn't actually send that letter. What they said instead was maybe in British Columbia, something similar is happening and I can ask for food there. So instead of going to Washington State across the border to try and get that kind of help or charity, they're like, that's too much work, even though we are literally like struggling to eat. Let's see if we can find a parallel opportunity within our own country. And so that's sort of what some of the book is about, is all of these moments where you can see the border's indirect effect on people's lives, where they never actually tried to cross the border because they were discouraged from doing so, and trying to rebuild that sort of hidden history that made the border really, really powerful.
That's amazing. It's so weird. Like, it's so weird to think about it because it's literally just a line on a map.
Yeah.
And like there's people that are
arbitrary line.
Yeah. And it has all of these consequences. That's, I don't know. As you're saying it, I'm just like, it's mind blowing. You're like, yeah, there's people in some spots telling you whether you can come in or can't, but just the fact that everything you're saying is fascinating. The fact that so much of it is unguarded, but people still won't cross it because it's just not worth it.
Right, because what you've done is you've expanded the border. So now the border crosses the whole country, and every day that you want to remain in that country, you have to justify your place there.
Yeah,
and that's very different than how I thought about a border. I thought it was sort of like, it's just this line on a map, and once you cross, you cross. And like I said, that legacy of that very different, much wider border came about because they knew they couldn't police the border. They knew it was too hard, and so they developed different strategies, like guarding port cities. And we do this today, right? The Canada-US border is not well guarded through long sections of its territory. But where is it guarded? Airports.
Yeah.
Right? You go through some crazy security and whatnot at airports because that's the easiest way to travel. You take away all the easy options, the highways that cross the border, the airports that cross the border, and you make people who are trying to cross illegally really have to work for it.
Yeah, right.
Right? You center all of your personnel. You don't spread them evenly across the line. You cluster them at where transportation networks go. And that's something they learned in the 19th century and something that you see all over the world today.
Yeah. Yeah, right. So you let the environment do it where it's difficult and then funnel everybody through these nodes and then police the nodes.
Yeah.
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 Wow.
And it's not perfect, but you don't have to make it perfect.
Yeah. Was there ever, like, I guess I don't think there would be today, but was there ever at any point in history spots where there was cities that were in disputed territory between the U.S. and Canada?
So early on, right, you think in the 19th century, you don't have satellites. You don't even have good maps. And so there are quite a few places that they mess up. I think Pembina might be one of them, where they put a military post, and then when the surveyors come through, they realize it's 3 kilometers on the wrong side of the line.
Oh, well.
You also get some really funky stuff. So the reason that the 49th parallel, the border follows the 49th parallel, is because it's really easy. You need zero knowledge of the geography to say it follows the 49th parallel. Like, I can just say my border just follows this, and wherever it goes, it goes.
Yeah, right.
But this creates these weird spots like Point Roberts, which is in British Columbia, where it's a peninsula that the border cuts across. So all the people in Point Roberts, to send their kids to school, have to send them into Canada around down back into the United States.
Oh, okay.
And in theory, if people were thinking, which they weren't at the time, you would have just said, look, Canada, you can have that peninsula. And in the Northwest Angle, we'll just trade a bit of money. We'll make this border make some semblance of sense, so you don't get these weird enclaves and other things like that.
Yeah.
It's not like it's valuable land. It's not like, this was a huge populated city or something like that. And so you get these like weird debates over land that is peripheral to both countries' interests. But the idea of giving up land to another country, however small, is so anathema to anything that you end up with these weird situations that dog us to this day, that could have been resolved in the 19th century when there weren't that many people in these specific areas. And neither country was nearly as attached to these lands. But because they made those choices, we're stuck with some really awkward situations.
Yeah, just weirdness. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. Great. Well, was there anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to talk about, or?
No, I think that was great.
Yeah. I learned quite a bit, and particularly the border and the board games. That's very fascinating. So.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I never thought that you could just spend part of your life learning to build games to teach. That was, I think, one of the things I've liked most about this job is the flexibility to pursue different intellectual interests, mm-hmm. and to try things and have them fail, and then try them again and have them fail until you get something that teaches history in a different way. Yeah, that's probably the most rewarding part of the career so far.
Yeah, I'd imagine. It seems like the university is giving you a decent amount of freedom to do that too.
Mm-hmm. Like as long as you publish and you win grants and you do all the things that they care about, it's kind of neat that you can purpose the kinds of work that you're interested in.
Yeah, totally. Wow, well, that's amazing. I've got I know someone that I think is gonna really enjoy our conversation. He's really into history and games, so he's actually as you were speaking, I was like, you're quite a lot like him and him like you, so it'll be good. Thank you for coming on. Is there anywhere where, like, if people want to find out how to take your classes or your research or just a little bit more about you, is there anywhere any direction you'd like to point them in?
Yeah, so I've got my first book is called The Line of Blood and Dirt, Creating the Canada-US Border Across Indigenous Lands. It's available through Amazon, most bookstores. It's got an audiobook, which is kind of cool. Mm-hmm. So if you're exercising or something like that, you can listen. And then the games are a little bit harder. Those are sort of academic articles, but if you ever want to chat about games, you can reach me at benjamin.hoy@usas.ca. Okay. Always happy to chat.
Great. Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of course.